Well, there goes another day without any Metroid Prime 4 news. I am getting so sick of it. They announced this game like 5 years ago now. What's the holdup? You know what? I'm not gonna stand for this, because you know what I am? I'm an American, damn it, and I make sure our voices are heard. Us Metroid fans need to stand up for what's right. So I will not leave this chair until we hear more news about Metroid Prime 4, even if it's the last thing I do.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem like we'll be hearing from Retro Studios on Prime 4's development status anytime soon. So instead of just sitting here and asking myself,
where are you?
I wanted to talk about the history, cut content, and differences between releases of the original Metroid game. Beginning development sometime in 1985, the game went by the name of Space Hunter during development. That is to say until the name Metroid was settled on, which is a combination of the words Metro and Android, due to the words reflecting the somewhat futuristic theming the game has going on. Development was helmed by Nintendo R&D 1 and Intelligent Systems, and it was somewhat infamously troubled. The game's character designer, Yoshio Sakamoto, reflects that when he joined the development team, despite having a definite deadline and release date planned, that there was very little progress made on the game itself. This was likely due to a variety of factors, but in my opinion, the most notable one being that the development environment for Metroid was incredibly open. Musicians would give their opinions on sprites and gameplay, sprite artists would give feedback on music and gameplay, game designers would give opinions on sprites and music, etc.
This isn't to suggest that this was a bad thing necessarily. In fact, I think part of the reason why Metroid's as unique and specialized as it is due to the unconventional methods in which it was developed. For instance, did you know that Samus wasn't designed with the intention of her being a woman? A programmer just walked into the office one day and was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if under that suit was a woman? It's just that having that many people providing their feedback and opinions complicates things. It's far easier to create something that one person's satisfied with versus something an entire development team is.
The game's troubled and slow development actually went on to affect another game in development by the same team, being Kid Icarus. Kid Icarus was kinda the side project from my understanding. Metroid was the team's primary focus and the game that they were actually wanting to make, while Kid Icarus was the game that was pretty much just a contractual obligation. As a result of this, Kid Icarus wasn't met with the same excitement or innovation from them. It reused a heavily modified version of Metroid's engine, and due to the team being fatigued from working on Metroid, the game was rushed along pretty quickly just to meet deadlines. Which, I feel is reflected in the quality of the game itself. Despite being developed in roughly the same time frame, Kid Icarus and Metroid couldn't be any further from each other in terms of theming. Kid Icarus takes inspiration from mythology, which is a drastic contrast to Metroid, which takes heavy inspiration from sci-fi horror movies, most notably being Alien. The connections that Alien has with Metroid is pretty well known, so I won't bore you guys with the full spiel about the extent of Alien's influence. In short, it was massively influential to the development team, and several things within the final product pay homage to the film. The most frequently recurring villain of the Metroid series, Ridley, is obviously named as a reference to the director of Alien, Ridley Scott. Furthermore, despite there not really being concrete confirmation one way or another, it is incredibly likely that Samus being a woman is yet another reference, as the main character in Alien is Ellen Ripley, who, yep, you guessed it, is a woman. Despite the seemingly arduous development of Metroid, the game was completed and the team was incredibly proud of their work. Following the game's completion, Sakamoto watched as the credits rolled by, and seeing everyone that struggled through development together's names all next to one another as curtains closed on the development process deeply resonated with him. From there, Metroid went on to be a massive franchise for Nintendo, and in recent years, Metroid has been the source of inspiration for some of the most critically acclaimed indie titles ever made. Hollow Knight is a big one, probably the big one, but many other successful indies such as Guacamelee and Axiom Verge, and even some smaller indie titles like Haiku the Robot take inspiration from the gameplay styles that were first created here. There's an entire subgenre named after the series, for Christ's sake. I don't think I really need to explain or justify myself in saying that Metroid has quickly become one of the most influential games ever made. So, the game was released worldwide, but it was released in pretty significantly different methods across the world. I've mentioned this several times on the channel already, so I won't regale you with the full story. But in Japan, Metroid was released on a disc format, while elsewhere it was released on a cartridge. As you can imagine, this led to there being several differences between the two releases. Most notably, the game's music and saving capabilities. In the States, Metroid infamously uses a password system to save a player's progress. This led to many popular passwords, such as Justin Bailey, which has the player being pretty well equipped in one of the game's final areas. Narpass Sword, which was a password used for debugging purposes, and was left in the final game presumably by mistake, and the one I find the most amusing, the notorious, Engage Ridley code. Using this code sets the time the player's been playing the game to 314.5 years. It will crash the game in most circumstances, and hilariously enough, it does set Ridley to a state in which he's been defeated. But this password system was something that wasn't in the original Japanese release, as the Japanese version uses a genuine save function. It uses a nearly identical layout to the Zelda saving system, and features some unique graphics exclusive to this version. But it appears that this wasn't always the case, as it seems that the international release may have originally intended to use save batteries to save players' progress. To look for this unconventional piece of cut content, we don't need to look at the game's code, rather at the physical cartridge for Metroid. Nintendo used several different boards to print their games. But for our purposes, there are only two important ones that we need to know about. These smaller ones, and these chunkier ones. Besides the difference in size, the major difference to take note of is the addition of a save battery on the larger PCB. This makes this board specifically have the functionality to save. As you probably guessed by now, Metroid uses this larger PCB, but is notably missing the save battery, which seems odd. Why would Nintendo print the game using this newer board, while not using the primary feature that the board was designed with in mind? Of the 5 games that Nintendo themselves published using this board, 3 games, being Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda, and NES Open Tournament Golf, all use the saving capabilities. This leaves 2 games they printed missing the save battery, one being Metroid, and the other being Kid Icarus, which is infinitely interesting. Kid Icarus and Metroid were both developed alongside one another, were released around the same time, and were both falling behind schedule. Odds are that the traditional saving system was scrapped from the cartridge release for one of 2 reasons. Either to save money on producing the cartridges, or that the games were so far behind that transferring the saving functionality to the cartridge release was an impossibility. So they opted to use the much easier to implement password system. Regardless of the reasoning, I think that it's clear that Metroid was originally intended to release worldwide with the original saving functionality intact. So its seemingly late removal is something that I find fascinating. Beyond that, there's some more obvious changes. Like, who would have guessed that the Japanese release uses Japanese text instead of English? But there are also a bevy of additional gameplay changes made between releases. For time's sake, I won't be listing them here, but if you check the description, I left a link to the Cutting Room Floors page on Metroid, which documents most of the changes in detail. Anyways, one of the most significant changes made between Japanese disk system releases and international cartridge releases are a game's music, and Metroid is no different. The Japanese title theme sounds substantially different. Take a listen. Several other tracks were altered, such as the theme that plays when Samus obtains an item, the fanfare that plays when Samus first appears, and the ending theme. One of the most interesting audio changes is from the escape theme from the ending of the game. The composition is pretty similar across releases, except for the fact that the Japanese version is much shorter. An additional section was added in the NES release, which I'll play here. And that covers all I wanted to talk about regarding the game's localization differences. But one must ask themselves, with Metroid's development environment being as open as it was, what changes were made during development? It's inevitable that changes will be made when everyone's giving their feedback. So what changes do we know about? And more importantly, what differences can be seen from early press releases? When it comes to development changes, there's an equal amount of changes made that we know of, as there are people that I've killed.
I guess that there's a first for everything.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot admittedly. There's one potentially significant change that might have been made, but there's also a solid 50% chance that I'm a total dumbass and a misunderstanding an interview. The quote reads, "Yeah, that's right. We made the running and shooting move very smoothly, but the game's development didn't expand as it was dangerous to do that close to release date." However, I wasn't thinking about that. Without warning, I said something like, "Let's try this," as an example of how it's done at Intelligent Systems. Basically, if they were told to take the stance of following instructions reliably, they would do no more than that. For me though, I was stacking my introductory experiences from small games with stage clear designs, like Balloon Fight. Even though I suddenly said, "Let's make something huge," I thought it would be hard to do. Moreover, I had wondered if I, one of those guys who'd been neglected, would make something completely worthless. This was said by Sakamoto, and it leaves me wondering if perhaps Metroid was planned to be linear instead of the exploration-based game we got. What I'm reading is that they completed a prototype that was just Samus running and shooting, incredibly far behind schedule, and to compensate for that, instead of creating several disconnected stages, they opted to design one huge connected level instead? I don't know. The wording here is awful, so I'm not going to make conclusions one way or another. Beyond that, the pre-release materials for Metroid reveal a bevy of additional alterations made prior to release. There is a substantially larger amount than I had originally anticipated. So to start, we'll be looking at changes evident from the game's Japanese manual. The Japanese manual is chock full of differences, starting as early as the title screen. At first glance, this looks pretty much the same as the final game, but several small differences are here. The title itself is missing light blue reflections that appear in the final game, but most significantly, rather than having the press start text centered with the screen, it's left-oriented to be flush with the copyright text. Beyond that, it's identical. So moving on to the next screenshot, it reveals something very interesting. What the fuck? Posing is something incredibly important, as it helps communicate the type of character someone is without outright saying it. And posing can heavily alter the perception someone has of a character. Take the Pokemon Baxcalibur, for instance. In Scarlet and Violet, he looks so damn dumb in his basic pose. But taking a look at a few of the TCG cards, he looks so cool. So first, I'm going to show you all the sprite used in the final Japanese release's save selection. How badass! She looks sick as hell. Her left arm is resting while her right arm is pointed somewhat forward, ready to fire at any moment. She's squatting in such a way to where she can quickly hop up at any second needed. Not to mention the direction she's facing, right at the player and forward with the rest of her body, which implies her focus. Let's look at the early one now. Credit where credit is due, the posing of the legs are pretty much the same, but everything else is really weird. Her left arm, instead of resting to the side, ready to be moved at any moment, it's resting on her knee. Not to mention her right arm. Good God, it looks broken. Why is her arm cannon pointing in a totally random direction? What would she possibly benefit from doing that? Not to mention, her focus isn't straight as it is in the final game. She's looking off to the right like a ditz. It's not even like the body mechanics of the early one is better. I recreated this pose in real life and just look at me! I look like a dipshit! It's nothing worth getting really heated about. I mean, it was replaced, but yeah, this early sprite is rough. The rest of the differences seen within the manual all have to do with character sprites, so I'll just go ahead and get the rest of Samus's out of the way. This is an early version of a sprite that shows Samus going into her morph ball. It has the same general pose, but overall it is a substantially different sprite. Notable changes include the way Samus's visor was detailed, and the reflection being moved from the back of the helmet to the top. This is an early version of Samus's front-facing sprite. Now, it may look like it's the same sprite, but there are several differences, such as a pixel being removed from both of the knees, a pixel being added onto her foot. There's some different shading on the left side of her chest plate, which was shaded with green in the final game, while here it has a simple black outline. The biggest difference has to do with her chest piece, which was shrunken for the final release. And it also features a very small difference in the reflections, with the left side having a mere pixel removed. Aside from Samus, a huge amount of the enemies in the game are shown with earlier sprites in the game's manual too. This early version of the Zeb and its recolor feature a whopping 2 additional pixels in the final game, which were added to make its expression look much more intimidating. This early version of the Waver looks slightly different, particularly at the top of the sprite, where it seems like it was angled a bit to give the perception of depth, while the final game gives it a much simpler, flat appearance. The Desgiga originally looked much less like his wife left him and took the kids, and instead it looks like he's had a little too much to drink. The eyes are the only major change made here, as every other part of the sprite is practically identical, save for a pixel-wide gap being added to his arms in the final game. These Novas have quite a few notable changes. For one, the blue one originally used a dark blue and yellow color scheme, while the final game uses a cyan and purple one. Beyond that, their sprites were originally much simpler. Though they look very similar upon first inspection, one will quickly notice the more detailed appearance of the final game's revision when compared to the original. Notably, the final one has a leg lifted to give the illusion of movement as the sprites flipped, and more separation was given to the tendrils at the top of the beasts' heads. This early version of the side hopper frankly looks awful. I don't even know what it's supposed to be. The final one is similarly somewhat unintelligible, but you can distinctly tell that it's supposed to be a weird bug thing based on what appears to be folded wings at the top, those nasty green eyes, and discernible pincers. Here though, it just looks like someone's uncle, so this was a pretty huge improvement for the final release. The Rinkas were originally slightly larger in size, and as a result featured more complex detailing. At the end of the day though, they're both just circles, so I think either one's fine. This early sprite for the Rio enemy looks very similar, albeit with his hands being changed. The final games make them more open, while here they look closed, more like fists if anything. This was probably changed to make the enemy's behavior make a little more sense. In the final game, due to the position of the hands, it looks like they're swooping down to rip away at Samus' suit, while this original design wouldn't convey that idea nearly as well. And finally, the most drastically altered sprites belong to the Zoomer enemies, which look wildly different here. Almost every part of their design was altered. The lighting on the spikes were made less harsh, the eyes were changed to look more intimidating, the segmentation was made more prominent, and certain spikes were made thicker. What I find interesting is that beyond the manual, there are remnants of this design on other physical Metroid media, here being the box art for the North American release. The design here much more closely resembles the early design than the final, most notably the less distinct segmentation, the harsher lighting, and his goofy ass eyes. Beyond enemies, there's one more difference seen in the manual when compared to the final game, being that the energy sprites were originally colored white, while in the final game they're colored black. That does it for manual differences, well, save for two that I'll be talking about here in a second. But Metroid was also featured in several magazines and commercials at the time to help promote its upcoming release. And as you can imagine, these promotional contents contain several additional differences when compared to the final game. Starting with this screenshot, it shows the mission debriefing scene from the final game, with the only major difference here being that Samus is just standing in the middle of the screen here, while she isn't in the final game. From here, the remainder of the screenshots shown have to do with altered level design. I won't be talking about images that simply show altered enemy placements, just because that would be boring, but some of these early designs are incredibly strange. This is probably the single strangest one, showing an early version of what's assumed to be this level chunk in the final game. Originally, it seems like the player would have had to use the Morph Ball in combination with the bombs to pass through this small opening, while the final game doesn't feature anything coming close to that kind of challenge. This was probably changed due to the apparent difficulty of the maneuver, or perhaps players just didn't understand what they were supposed to do here. This one is identical layout-wise, but it features some slight alterations to coloring. The Cloud-esque platforms appear to be shaded with blue here, while in the final game they're detailed with gray. The door that appears on the left appears yellow, while in the final game it's red, and the smallest change so far, the lava was detailed with yellow here, while in the final game it's detailed with blue. And for the last piece of pre-release material, this screenshot shows that in early versions of the game, this gray platform was originally 2 blocks thick instead of just 1.
I know, contain your excitement. It's gonna be tough for me to top that change in the future, let alone during this video. But what the hell, I might as well try. So join me as in our final section we take a look at unused content found within the game's data.
To start, I want to talk about the 2 pre-release things I skipped earlier, as they relate to what's probably the most significant pieces of cut content from the game. Starting with this screenshot of the multi-viola enemy, which is wildly different when compared to the final game's depiction. What's interesting is that the sprite for this early design can still be found in the game's code, albeit with the colors being royally screwed up. Beyond that, the second pre-release thing I skipped earlier is far more interesting, being this image of Samus. Now, this looks like a normal enough picture on first inspection, until you realize that this specific sprite of Samus has no equivalent in the final game. In fact, unused in the game's code are a series of unique sprites made for when Samus is facing left, which this image depicts an early version of. As to why these unique left-facing sprites were scrapped, I have no idea. Most of the time I would say it was to save memory, but these sprites are still in the game's data, so I don't know. Not to mention the fact that this isn't even a case of the developers just forgetting to implement it, as it's seen in another bit of gameplay proving that it was properly in the game at some point. It appears that Samus as she appears on the North American box art is actually based on this unused series of left-facing sprites. This is evident by her chest plate being visible, which is usually obscured in the final game due to her using the arm that's closest to the player to fire at all times. Perhaps this was a simple oversight of the developers, but at any rate, this is one of the most fascinating pieces of cut content I've covered on the channel thus far, primarily for the seeming lack of reason behind its eventual removal. Unfortunately, the remainder of the game's unused content isn't nearly as exciting. Well, save for one, which I'm saving for last. We have a fake Ridley enemy that goes unused, which was likely scrapped due to there not really being a suitable place for it to appear in the final game. Then we've got this unused sprite, which the Spriters Resource has fittingly dubbed a Space Cabbage. These unused sprites of what appears to be a scrapped flamethrower obstacle, and these mystery sprites, which could really be just about anything. Though to me they seem to be simple alternative explosion or projectile sprites. And finally, for the most significant piece of cut content of the video, nay, of my life, our lives will forever be changed once we see it. If you aren't ready for the years of potential psychological torment this discovery will do unto you, please turn the video off now. I'll be showing it in 3, 2, 1. Okay, here it is, but don't say I didn't warn ya. It's a foot. An unused foot.
And that does it for the development, history, altered, and cut content for the original Metroid game. I really enjoy Metroid as a series, and I really enjoyed making this video, so I'll definitely be making some more Metroid content in the future. You know, come to think about it, I should make it line up for when Prime 4 finally comes out. Well, I guess in that case, I'll be seeing you guys again in 2026. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope you had a good time learning about the history of Metroid.